Rain in Seoul doesn't fall so much as it judges. It comes down in sheets that flatten the neon, that turn Gangnam's glass towers into smeared watercolors. And on this particular night, it was falling on one man standing outside a locked glass door with a lacquered box in his hands worth more than most people's homes. Kang Tae-min, 39 years old, chairman of the Cho Industries Group, a construction and finance empire worth $11 billion, built on his grandfather's back, inherited through his father's ruin, and controlled, absolutely and coldly, by his own hands. He did not stand in the rain. Men like Kang Tae-min did not wait for anyone. His time was priced in the millions per hour. His assistants carried 3 umbrellas at all times so that he never had to. Tonight, he had sent them all away. He knocked once, twice. The lights inside the small architecture studio stayed dark, except for one lamp glowing at the back, where a woman with locks pulled into a loose knot sat hunched over a drafting table, deliberately, pointedly, not looking up. Amara. His voice cracked on her name, a name that 4 months ago he hadn't even bothered to learn. Amara, I know you can hear me. Nothing. He set the lacquered box down on the wet stone step. Inside it was not jewelry. It was not a check, though God knew he'd tried that already, more than once, and God knew how badly that had gone. Inside that box was something that had taken him 3 months, 6 architects, 2 demolitions, and every ounce of the humility he didn't know he had to build. I'm not leaving, he said to the door, to the dark glass, to the reflection of a soaked, ruined man in a $5,000 coat. You can keep the lights off. I'll stand here till the sun comes up if I have to. Somewhere behind that glass, a woman who had once been mistaken for a servant in his own family's house was deciding whether the most powerful man in Korean construction deserved so much as a single word from her. Beat. To understand how Kang Tae-min ended up drowning outside a dark studio at 2 in the morning, begging a woman he'd once treated like she was invisible, we have to go back 4 months. Back to the one afternoon he assumed a queen was a maid, and it cost him everything he thought mattered. If this is your first time here, welcome to Seoul Sauce, where the coffee's dark, the men are complicated, and the women never, ever need saving. Hit subscribe now because trust me, you don't want to miss where this one goes. Drop a fire in the comments if you're already Team Amara. Let's get into it. For months earlier, the Cho family estate sat 40 minutes outside Seoul in the hills of Gyeonggi-do, a compound that had been in the family for 3 generations. A sprawling Hanok main house wrapped in gardens so meticulously kept that even the moss grew where it was told. It was the kind of place that photographed like a postcard and functioned like a fortress. Tae-min had grown up here, learning at 7 years old that a Cho does not raise his voice, because a Cho does not need to. People simply obeyed. Amara Bankol did not know any of that history when she pulled her rental car through the estate's outer gate at 8:40 that Tuesday morning, 40 minutes before her scheduled walk-through appointment, dressed in jeans, worn hiking boots, and an old university sweatshirt with a coffee stain on the sleeve. She hadn't come to impress anyone. She'd come to work. At 34, Amara was the lead structural conservation architect for Hartley & Kwan, the firm handling the seismic retrofit and heritage preservation certification for the estate, a certification the Cho Industries Group needed urgently before it could break ground on a $12 billion luxury development 1 property over. Without her sign-off, without her firm's federal heritage clearance, the entire project stalled. Permits froze. Investors got nervous. And nervous investors, in Tae-min's world, meant blood in the water. Amara knew none of the politics yet. She only knew the wisteria along the east wall was original, at least 110 years old, and that its root system might be undermining a load-bearing foundation nobody had inspected since the park administration. She'd come early because she wanted an hour alone with the building before anyone started talking numbers at her. She was on her knees in the garden bed, measuring a hairline crack in the foundation stone with calipers, dirt on her palms, when a shadow fell across her. You, there you are. She looked up. A tall man in a charcoal suit, no tie, sunglasses pushed up into perfectly styled hair, stood over her with the particular irritation of a man whose schedule had been disturbed. I've been calling the house for 20 minutes, Tae-min said. The tea service for the Osaka investors was supposed to be set up by 8. Where is the rest of the staff? Amara blinked up at him, sun in her eyes, calipers still in hand. I'm sorry, what? The tea, he repeated, slower. The way you'd repeat something to someone you assumed didn't speak the language well. Green tea, not the ceremonial set, the everyday porcelain in the east sitting room. And tell whoever's doing the flowers that the peonies in the foyer are already wilting. I want them replaced before 10. Took Amara a full 3 seconds to understand what was happening. Then it took her another 3 to decide how she wanted to handle it. I think there's been a mix-up, she said, standing, brushing dirt from her knees, extending a hand that he did not take. I'm Amara Bankole, Hartley and Kwan Architecture. I have a 9:15 with your facilities director regarding the heritage survey. Taemin's eyes flicked over her, the sweatshirt, the boots, the dirt on her hands, the tool bag at her feet that, to him in that half-second of a glance, looked exactly like a housekeeper's kit. Facilities director doesn't handle the household staff, he said, already turning away, already dismissing her from his mental register. You'll find the kitchen through the side entrance. And please try to be ready before guests arrive next time. This is a Cho property. We don't do things twice here. He walked away without waiting for a response, already lifting his phone to his ear, already 3 problems ahead in his mind, already certain that the matter was closed. Amara stood in the garden, calipers still in her hand, and watched the back of a $5,000 coat disappear into the house. Let's be very clear about what just happened, because it matters. Kang Taemin did not ask her name. He did not wait for an answer. He looked at a black woman on her knees in his garden, in work clothes with dirt on her hands, and his mind filled in the rest of the story for him instantly without a single fact to back it up. He didn't see a structural engineer with 2 master's degrees and a heritage conservation license that took her 9 years to earn. He saw a role. And in his world, that role came with a very specific set of assumptions about who gets to give orders, and who's supposed to say yes, sir. She didn't say yes, sir. Amara did not chase him down. She did not raise her voice. She finished measuring the crack in the foundation stone, packed her tools with steady hands, and walked around to the front entrance, where, 20 minutes later, she was greeted properly by the facilities director, a nervous, apologetic man named Mr. Su who clearly had no idea what had just transpired in the garden. Ms. Bankole, thank you for coming. I hope the drive wasn't too. He stopped, catching the look on her face. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, she said, and it was mostly because Amara Bankole had spent 15 years in an industry that routinely mistook her for the wrong thing in a room. The assistant instead of the lead, the intern instead of the licensed engineer, the help instead of the one holding the permit that made or broke the entire deal. She'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to correct the record wasn't to explain herself in the moment. It was to simply do the job so well that the correction became undeniable. She spent 4 hours walking the property. She found the wisteria root intrusion. She found a hairline shift in the eastern retaining wall that, if left untreated through another rainy season, could compromise an entire wing of the main house. She found, in short, exactly the kind of catastrophic deal-ending liability that would require her firm's sign-off to resolve, the sign-off that stood, unknowingly, between Kang Taemin and his 12 billion won development. At 2 in the afternoon, she was escorted into the main conference room for the formal introduction meeting, where the Osaka investors, the Cho Industries board, and, sitting at the head of the table, sleeves now rolled, tie discarded, radiating the low-grade impatience of a man who'd already had a long day, Kang Taemin waited. Chairman Kang, Mr. Su said, this is Ms. Amara Bankole, lead conservation architect from Hartley and Kwan. She'll be presenting the structural survey that determines our heritage certification timeline. Taemin looked up from his tablet. The room did not go silent exactly, but something in it shifted, the particular, specific silence of a man realizing in real time in front of 11 other people that he had made a catastrophic error, and that the woman standing at the front of his boardroom, holding a laser pointer and a stack of structural reports, was the exact same woman he had ordered to fetch tea and replace wilting peonies 4 hours earlier. Amara did not flinch. She did not smile. She clicked to her first slide. Good afternoon, she said, her voice even professional, giving him absolutely nothing to work with. I'd like to start with the Eastern Foundation wall, which I believe you'll find is more urgent than anyone in this room currently realizes. For the next 40 minutes, Amara Bankole systematically and expertly dismantled every assumption anyone in that room might have had about who held the power in it. She spoke of load calculations and seismic thresholds and heritage code violations with the calm authority of someone who had never once needed anyone's approval to know her own worth. She did not look at Tae-min. Not once. And that, more than anything she said about foundation stress, was what undid him. Because Kang Tae-min was a man who was used to being looked at. Feared, admired, resented, obeyed, but always looked at. Being erased from a room by a woman he'd wronged that morning was an experience so foreign to him that he spent the entire meeting only half listening to the numbers, and entirely listening to the silence where his name should have been. You can feel secondhand embarrassment radiating off your screen right now. Comment Amar. Sue saw everything below, and if you haven't liked this video yet, now's the time, because Chairman Kang is about to spend the next 3 months finding out that money cannot buy back a first impression. Let's keep going. He tried to catch her after the meeting. Ms. Bankole. He caught up to her in the hallway, where she was packing her tablet into a leather satchel with the unhurried precision of someone who had absolutely nowhere she needed to be for him. A word, if you have a moment. I have a 4 o'clock in the city, she said, not stopping. Mr. Sue has my full report and the certification timeline. If there are questions, they can go through my office. I want to apologize. The words came out clumsier than he intended, because Kang Tae-min had not had to say them in earnest in longer than he could remember. This morning, in the garden, I made an assumption I shouldn't have made, and You did? She agreed, finally stopping, finally turning to face him directly, and there was nothing in her expression for him to read. No anger, no hurt, nothing he could apologize to. Just a flat, professional appraisal, the same one she'd give a compromised foundation wall. You made an assumption based on how I looked in your own garden without asking a single question first. That's not really a mistake, Chairman Kang. A mistake is when you don't have the information. You didn't ask for the information. You just decided. I understand that this. I don't think you do, actually, she said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. But that's all right. You don't have to understand it. You just have to sign off on the certification package my firm sends over, and then we never have to see each other again. She walked to her car. She did not look back. And Kang Tae-min stood in the gravel drive of the house he'd grown up in, watching a rental sedan disappear down the same road his family's cars had traveled for 3 generations, feeling something he did not have a name for yet, because it had been so long since anyone had made him feel small. 3 days later, a courier arrived at the offices of Hartley and Kwan with a box wrapped in the kind of paper that costs more per square inch than most people's rent. Inside was a bracelet, platinum, a single black diamond at its center, with a card that read, in careful, formal English, Ms. Bankole, please accept this as a token of my sincere apology. Kang Tae-min. Amara looked at it for exactly 4 seconds before she called her assistant in. Return this, she said. Same courier, same day, no note needed. It's a Cho Group courier, Ms. Bankole. He's a client. He's a client who owes my firm a signature, not a jeweler who owes me a gift, Amara said, sliding the box back across her desk. Send it back. The bracelet arrived back at Cho Industries headquarters that same afternoon, unopened, unworn, unacknowledged in any way except its return, and Tae-min, staring at the box on his desk, felt something close to panic for the first time in a business relationship in his adult life. He was a man who solved problems with capital. It was the only language he'd ever needed, and for the first time the language wasn't landing. So he tried louder. The following week, an anonymous donation of 200 million won arrived at the Seoul chapter of the Society of Black Architects and Engineers of Korea, an organization Amara had co-founded 6 years earlier to support diaspora professionals navigating an industry that routinely underestimated them. The donation letter listed no name. It didn't need one. Amara found out within an hour, because the organization's treasurer, breathless with excitement, called her directly. She sat very still at her desk for a long moment after that call. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't planned on using again. You can't buy your way out of what you did, she said. The second he picked up, no greeting, no preamble. And weaponizing my own organization to try is worse than the original mistake. That donation isn't a gift, Chairman Kong. It's a bribe with better PR. It's not conditional on anything, Taemin said. And for the first time there was something almost desperate under the smoothness of his voice. I looked into your work. What you've built with that organization, it matters. I wanted to support it. Then support it without my name attached to why, Amara said. Give the money if you believe in the mission. Don't give it because you're trying to buy back a smile you never earned in the first place. She hung up before he could answer. Okay, but real talk, was the donation a genuinely good move badly timed? Or straight-up manipulation with a bow on it? I need to know where you all land on this. Drop your take in the comments because Amara is not playing games, and honestly, neither should you. Smash that like button if you're rooting for her to make him work for every inch. Word travels fast in small, wealthy circles, and within 2 weeks, half of Seoul's development elite knew that the chairman of Cho Industries had, in the span of a single month, insulted his own foundation architect and then tried, twice, to buy his way out of it publicly and clumsily enough that both attempts had become office gossip from Gangnam to Uido. For Taemin's board, humiliation was worse than any structural defect. Older board members, men who had served under his father and grandfather, men who viewed the chairman's recent ascension with the quiet, patient skepticism of people waiting for him to prove he wasn't ready, saw an opening. The heritage certification is critical path for the entire development, said board member Yoon Ha-rim, a silver-haired veteran of 3 previous Cho administrations. During an emergency session Taemin hadn't called and hadn't wanted. If this architect decides to slow-walk the paperwork out of personal grievance, we lose our financing window with the Osaka Group. I move that we terminate the Hartley and Kwon contract and bring in Daehan Structural instead. They're faster, they're cheaper, and they don't have a personal history with our chairman. It was, on its surface, a reasonable business argument. It was also, underneath, an attempt to strip Taemin of control over the one relationship in the company he could no longer manage, and everyone in the room knew it. No, Taemin said, and something in his voice made even Yoon Ha-rim pause. Chairman. Ms. Bankol's survey identified a structural failure that Daehan's own preliminary inspection missed entirely 8 months ago, Taemin said, and it was the first time in this entire ordeal that he'd spoken about Amara's competence rather than his own guilt. If we'd built on top of that eastern wall without her assessment, we'd have had a wing collapse within 2 rainy seasons, and the lawsuits from that would have made this delay look like nothing. She is not the problem. She is the only reason we found the problem before it became a body count. The room went quiet. It was, in its own strange way, the truest apology Amara Bankol never heard. Spoken in a boardroom she wasn't in, to men who would never repeat it to her, motivated by something that had finally, quietly, started to shift in Kang Taemin from guilt into respect. But respect spoken behind closed doors doesn't undo an insult delivered in a garden. And Taemin was about to learn that the hard way over and over again. Taemin's next move was, by any objective measure, insane. He commissioned, quietly at first, through a shell holding company so it wouldn't trace back to him immediately, the purchase of the small architecture studio 2 blocks from Amara's office, the one with the good light and the exposed brick that she'd mentioned once, in passing, during a site visit, as the kind of space she dreamed of opening her own conservation-focused practice in someday. He bought the building outright. He hired her favorite contractor, a small heritage restoration crew she'd worked with on a museum project the year before, and had them begin renovating it exactly to the specifications she'd once idly sketched on a napkin during a lunch break she hadn't realized he'd been listening closely enough to remember. 3 weeks and $400,000 later, he had a keyless entry code sent to her office with a card that read, "A space of your own. No conditions. TM." Amara stood in the doorway of the finished studio, dust sheets still hanging from half the fixtures, sunlight pouring through the exact large windows she'd once dreamed out loud about, and felt something far more complicated than anger. Because it was beautiful. Because it was, in painful, precise detail, exactly what she wanted. And because none of that changed the fact that a man had bought an entire building based on something she said in passing, without asking her, without her consent, in the same way he'd once decided who she was without asking her name. She called him from the doorway. "Do you understand what you did?" Her voice, for the first time in this entire saga, wasn't flat. It had an edge to it now, something rawer underneath the professionalism. You didn't listen to what I actually wanted. You listened to a fragment of a conversation and then you built your version of what you think I want on your terms, on your timeline, and you didn't ask me a single question before you did it. That's not generosity, Chairman Kong. That's the exact same thing you did in the garden. You're just doing it with better production value. There was a long silence on the line. I wanted to give you something you couldn't return, Taemin said finally, quietly, and for the first time, he sounded less like a chairman and more like a man who had genuinely, badly miscalculated something that mattered to him. The bracelet, the donation, you were right to send them back. I thought if I built something real, something you'd actually use. You still didn't ask, Amara said. You still decided you knew what I needed better than I did. Don't you see the pattern? Taemin, you're not sorry for what happened in the garden. You're sorry you got caught not knowing who I was. And now you're trying to fix that by still not asking who I am. She left the keys on the counter and walked out. If you felt that in your chest, you are not alone. Comment the keys on the counter if that line got you. And hit subscribe right now, because Seoul Sauce drops new episodes every week and you do not want to miss what Taemin does after this conversation. Trust me, it gets worse before it gets better. For the first time since the garden, Kang Taemin did not immediately try to fix it. He sat in the empty, beautifully renovated studio for 3 hours after she left, alone. The sun moving across the exposed brick walls, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he simply thought, really thought instead of strategized. He thought about his father, who had run Cho Industries the same way, mistaking control for care, mistaking expensive gestures for genuine attention, right up until the year everything collapsed. The year his father lost the company's Busan holdings in a hostile buyout because he'd spent so much energy managing appearances that he'd stopped actually listening to the people telling him the deal was rotten. Taemin had sworn at 26, standing in the wreckage of his father's mistakes, that he would never run a company or a life that way. And yet here he was. He thought about the boardroom, about defending Amara's competence to men who'd never bothered to see it themselves, and how easy that had been compared to the much harder work of actually seeing her himself, weeks earlier, in his own garden on his own property, when it would have cost him nothing but a single question. Excuse me, who are you? He thought, finally, uncomfortably, about every person he'd ever walked past without truly registering. Every driver, every assistant, every junior staffer who existed in his peripheral vision as a function rather than a person, and understood, for the first time, that the garden hadn't been an aberration. It had been a habit, finally caught on camera, in a moment that happened to matter to someone with the power and the dignity to refuse to let it slide. That night, he did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He called his older sister, Kang Ji-yeon, who'd left the family business a decade earlier to run an independent nonprofit, and who had, more than once, told him exactly what she thought of the way he moved through the world. I need you to tell me the truth about something, he said. And I need you to not enjoy it too much while you do. Oh, this is going to be good, Ji-yeon said. What did you do? He told her everything. The garden, the tea, the bracelet, the donation, the building, all of it in order without softening a single detail, and when he finished, his sister was quiet for a long moment. Do you know what your problem is, Taemin? She said finally. You keep trying to solve a relationship problem with a business solution. You built her a studio like you're closing an acquisition. You gave her a bracelet like you're settling a lawsuit. You donated to her organization like you're managing PR fallout. Every single move you've made has been about controlling the outcome instead of actually reckoning with what you did. You haven't apologized to her once, not really. You've just tried to buy the apology so you wouldn't have to sit in the discomfort of actually earning it. Taemin sat with that for a long time after they hung up. He did not send anything for the next 6 weeks. Instead, Amara began noticing something stranger. Kang Taemin started showing up to things. Not to her, never directly, never in a way that could be read as pursuit, but to the spaces her work touched. He attended quietly, without press, a Society of Black Architects and Engineers panel on heritage conservation, sitting in the back row, taking notes on his phone like every other attendee, and left before the Q&A so no one would make it about him. He funded, anonymously through a foundation with no Cho Industries branding attached, 3 scholarships for diaspora engineering students, Scholarships Amara only discovered were his when a recipient's thank you letter, forwarded through the organization's general inbox, happened to reference a benefactor whose staff had insisted, very specifically, on no name recognition of any kind. He actually read, not headlines, not summaries prepared by his assistants, but the actual academic papers Amara had published on heritage seismic retrofitting in diaspora-owned historic properties across Seoul's older neighborhoods. Staying up past midnight in his office with a highlighter and a stack of printouts, trying to understand not just what she did but why she'd built her entire career around protecting buildings other people were too quick to tear down. And when the board tried, a second time, to push Daehan Structural into the project, this time framing it not as a business decision but as a quiet, deniable racial dog whistle about cultural fit with international investors, Taemin didn't just defend Amara's competence this time. He fired the board member who'd made the comment, publicly, in a statement that made 3 business publications without ever naming Amara at all because, as he told his sister that night, this was never about making it about me. It was about making sure it never happens to her again in a room I control. Amara heard about all of it, eventually the way these things travel through small industries. And none of it moved her the way the bracelet or the building had failed to move her, because none of it had her name on it. None of it was designed to be seen by her. It was simply, finally, him doing the actual work of becoming someone different, in rooms she wasn't even in. This is the part where I need you to comment below. Is quiet change more powerful than the big grand gesture? Or does it just mean he finally learned how to be sneaky about the same manipulation? I have thoughts and I want yours too. Like this video if you're starting to come around on Chairman Kong, even just a little. We're not done yet. It was Amara who finally sought him out 3 months after the garden. Not because she'd forgiven him, but because the final certification package needed his direct signature, and Hartley and Kwan's policy required the lead architect to walk the client through the closing documentation in person. They met, for the first time since the studio at the estate. The same garden, though it was late autumn now, the wisteria gone dormant, the retaining wall she'd flagged now fully reinforced, its stones reset with the exact careful, historically accurate masonry technique she'd specified in her report. You used the traditional lime mortar, she said, running a hand along the repaired wall, surprised despite herself. Most contractors would have pushed for modern concrete. It's cheaper, faster. You said in your report that the lime mortar breathes with the stone over decades, and the concrete would crack the foundation from the inside within 20 years. Taemin said, standing a respectful distance away, hands in his coat pockets, none of the old imperiousness in his posture anymore. I told the contractor I didn't care what was faster. I cared what you said was right. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Really looked, the first time she'd let herself do that since the boardroom. Why are you doing all of this? She asked. The panel, the scholarships, firing Director Han over that comment. None of it had my name on it. None of it was going to reach me unless I happened to find out. What's the angle, Taemin? There isn't one, he said. That was the point. I spent months trying to buy my way back to a version of you that would forgive me quickly, because that's what I know how to do. Solve problems fast, close the gap, move on. And every time you were right to refuse it because I wasn't actually doing anything except managing my own guilt. So I stopped trying to fix how you felt about me. I started trying to actually become someone who wouldn't have made that mistake in the first place. Whether or not you ever forgive me for the garden, that part isn't about you anymore. That part's about who I want to be when the next person is on their knees in the dirt and I don't yet know who they are. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally started, soft, and neither of them moved to leave. That's the first thing you've said to me in 3 months that wasn't trying to fix something, Amara said quietly. I know, Taemin said. It's the first thing I've meant in longer than that. Okay, if you are not tearing up a little right now, we are simply not watching the same video. Comment lime mortar below if that hit you the way it hit me, and subscribe now because we are heading into the final stretch and it is about to get so much harder before it gets better. For a while, a fragile, cautious while, something almost like a friendship formed in the space where an apology used to fail. Amara found herself, without quite deciding to, staying 20 minutes later after site visits, answering Taemin's increasingly informed questions about conservation architecture with something less like professional obligation and more like genuine engagement. He asked good questions now. He'd done the reading. He listened, actually listened, letting silences sit instead of filling them with his own opinion, in a way that felt disorientingly like talking to a completely different person than the man in the garden. He told her, one evening over a coffee that started as a work meeting and stretched 2 hours past its agenda, about his father, about growing up watching a man who mistook fear for respect and control for love, who lost the Busan holdings not because he was unlucky but because he'd surrounded himself with people too afraid to tell him the truth, and how Taemin had spent 15 years terrified of becoming exactly that, only to discover, in a garden in April, that he already had. She told him, in turn, about her own path, the university professor in London who'd told her, flatly, in her second year, that heritage architecture wasn't really a field for people like her. The 11 job rejections before Hartley and Kwan finally hired her, not despite her insistence on culturally informed conservation methods, but because of it, the quiet, exhausting arithmetic of walking into every new site knowing she'd have to prove her competence twice before anyone extended her the professional courtesy a man in a suit received automatically. That's what the garden was, she said. Not really about you specifically. You were just the 400th version of the same math I've been doing my whole career. The only difference is you had the power to actually change what happens next time. Most people who do what you did never even find out they did it. It was the closest thing to an actual bridge either of them had built in this entire ordeal, and it lasted almost 3 weeks before the board found a new way to blow it apart. Yoon Harim, still smarting from his humiliation months earlier, had been quietly building a case. Not against Amara this time, but against Taemin himself, framing his personal fixation, as internal memos would later describe it, on the firm's lead architect as a conflict of interest jeopardizing the entire Osaka investment relationship. The story leaked, carefully, deliberately, to a business tabloid 3 days before the final closing ceremony for the development deal. CHO Industries chairman's obsession with foreign architect raises governance concerns among board. The article, sourced anonymously from individuals close to the matter, painted Taemin's scholarship funding, his studio purchase, his defense of Amara against director Han, not as growth or accountability, but as an erratic, possibly inappropriate fixation on a foreign national contractor, with a none too subtle implication that Amara herself had somehow engineered the entire situation for personal financial gain. It named her, in print, with a photograph taken outside her office, clearly shot without her knowledge, clearly meant to imply something salacious that had never once been true. Amara found out from a colleague's frantic phone call at 7 in the morning. By 9, 3 separate journalists had called her office. By 11, Hartley and Kwan's senior partners were in an emergency call with her, gently, carefully, asking whether it might be cleaner for everyone if she stepped back from the Cho Industries account entirely, just until the noise died down. She called Taemin at noon, and for the first time since the garden, she was the one who sounded shaken. "They named me," she said. "They put my name and my photograph next to insinuations that I don't even want to repeat, and my own firm is asking if I should quietly disappear so it's easier for everyone. This is exactly why I don't let my personal name get tangled up with a client. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid this entire time." "I'm handling it," Taemin said, already standing, already calling for his car. "That's not what I need to hear right now," Amara said, and her voice cracked, just slightly, the first crack in 3 months of perfect composure. "I need you to understand that this isn't a business problem you can solve with a press release. My name is out there now. My face is out there now. And no amount of money is going to undo the fact that some board member decided my career and my reputation were acceptable collateral damage in a fight that was never actually about me. I know. Comment not collateral damage below because Amara deserved so much better than this. And if you're not already subscribed, now is genuinely the time, because what happens in the next 10 minutes decides whether Kang Taemin actually deserves her or not. No pressure, Chairman. Just $11 billion and a woman's entire reputation on the line. Taemin called an emergency board meeting that afternoon, not to defend himself, but to do something none of them expected. "I'm stepping back from the Osaka closing ceremony," he announced, to a room full of stunned executives. "Director Yoon will represent Cho Industries at tomorrow's signing. I'm not doing this because I'm avoiding accountability. I'm doing it because the story that ran this morning happened because someone in this room decided that a woman's reputation was an acceptable weapon to use against me. And until that person is identified and removed from this board, I am not interested in standing next to any of you in front of a camera. Chairman, the closing ceremony is tomorrow. The Osaka investors expect a functioning, ethical partner, Taemin said. Not a board that leaks a false, racially coded story about a decorated architect to a tabloid because they lost a power struggle. I've already spoken with legal. We're issuing a retraction demand to the publication, a formal statement clarifying the entirely professional nature of Hartley and Kwan's engagement, and an internal investigation into the source of the leak, and whoever that investigation identifies will be removed from this board by end of week, regardless of tenure, regardless of relationship to my father. That's not a negotiation. That's the condition under which I remain chairman of this company. The room was silent. Yoon Harim, sitting near the back, did not meet anyone's eyes. Took 11 hours. By midnight, the internal investigation, helped along by a nervous junior staffer who'd been asked to route the leak and had kept a paper trail out of self-preservation, confirmed what everyone already suspected. Yoon Harim was removed from the board the following morning, 20 minutes before the retraction statement went out under Cho Industries' official letterhead. Publicly, unambiguously, naming no one but taking full institutional responsibility for the harm caused. Taemin called Amara himself. At 1 a.m, voice hoarse with exhaustion. It's done, he said. The retraction is going out. Yoon is gone. I know it doesn't undo this morning. I know a correction never travels as far as the original story did. But I needed you to know that I chose this. Not the deal. Not the closing ceremony. You. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You should have chosen that from the beginning, Amara said finally quietly. Not after the story broke. In the garden. That's still the wound, Taemin. Everything since then has been you catching up to a decision you should have made 4 months ago, and I don't know how to just erase the fact that it took a public crisis for you to finally put me before the deal. I know, he said. I'm not calling because I think this fixes it. I'm calling because I didn't want another day to go by where you didn't know exactly where I stood. Even if it's too late to matter. She hung up without answering. Amara did step back from the Cho Industries account. Not because her firm pressured her into it, but because she requested it herself formally in writing the week after the retraction ran. A colleague, Marcus Adeyemi, took over the final closing documentation. The development moved forward. The certification was granted. The deal that had once hinged entirely on her signature closed without her in the room for the final signing. Taemin did not contact her again. Not with gifts, not with gestures, not with anything at all, because for the first time in this entire saga, he finally, fully understood what she'd been trying to tell him from the very beginning. That the absence of pursuit was itself a form of respect. That the most important thing he could do, after everything, was let her have the space to decide, entirely on her own terms and her own timeline, whether she ever wanted to see him again, instead of continuing to make that decision about his own need for resolution. It was, without question, the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than the board fight. Harder than firing Yoon Harim. Harder, even, than sitting in that empty studio 3 months earlier and finally reckoning with the kind of man he'd become without noticing. He threw himself into the actual, unglamorous work of change instead, the kind that doesn't photograph well, that nobody writes tabloid stories about. He restructured Cho Industries' vendor selection process to require blind qualification review for the first 2 rounds of any contractor bid, so that names, photographs, and personal details couldn't influence who got shortlisted. He funded quietly, permanently, structurally rather than as a one-time gesture. A full endowed fellowship at the Society of Black Architects and Engineers, administered entirely by the organization's own board, with zero Cho Industries input on recipients. He spent, over the following months, an increasing number of his Saturdays not at the estate, not at the office, but sitting in on university guest lectures, community planning meetings, heritage preservation panels, quietly learning to actually see the people and the work that existed outside the narrow, insulated world he'd been raised inside. He became, by every external measure, a better version of the man who'd stood in that garden. And he did it, deliberately, without any expectation that it would ever be witnessed, let alone rewarded. It was Amara, in the end, who returned to the studio. 8 weeks after she'd stepped back from the account, on a quiet Tuesday evening, she let herself in with a key she'd kept, the one she'd left on the counter that day, retrieved quietly, weeks later, by an assistant under instructions to simply return it to her office without comment. No note attached, no acknowledgement sought. The building was exactly as she'd left it, untouched, unrented, unsold, sitting empty for months, its beautiful light pouring uselessly through the windows Taemin had installed to her exact, half-remembered specifications, because he had never once, in all that time, tried to reclaim it, repurpose it, or offer it to anyone else. She stood in the empty space for a long time. Then she called him. "I'm in the studio," she said, when he picked up, surprise evident even in his silence. "It's still empty." "It's yours," he said. "It was always yours. He stopped himself. "I stopped trying to make you take it. I figured if you ever wanted it, you'd come find it yourself on your own terms. And if you didn't, that was your right too. Why didn't you sell it? Rent it out? It's been sitting empty for months." Taemin. "That's not a small amount of money to just leave dormant." "Because it was never about the money," he said simply. "It never was. I think that's the one thing I actually understood, eventually, underneath everything else I got wrong. We are so close, do not leave now." Comment on her own terms, if you feel like this is finally the version of Taemin we've been waiting for. And subscribe if you haven't already, because the next scene is the one this entire story has been building toward. Which brings us back to where we started. The rain outside the studio. The lacquered box on the wet stone step. Kang Taemin, soaked through, standing in front of a door he had no legal right to walk through anymore, because he had signed the deed for this building back over to her, quietly 3 weeks earlier, with no strings, no conditions, no expectation of anything in return. A gift finally given the right way, which is to say, a gift given and then genuinely let go of. Amara had watched him from the dark studio for 11 minutes before she finally crossed the room and opened the door. "You're going to catch a cold," she said, which was not what either of them expected her to say first. "I've been standing in worse for longer," Taemin said, water dripping from his hair, from his ruined coat, holding out the lacquered box with hands that, for the first time in this entire story, were visibly unsteady. "This isn't a gift. I need you to know that before you open it. It's not a bracelet. It's not a building. It's not anything I'm asking you to accept or forgive or respond to. I just needed you to have it." Amara took the box. She did not open it yet. "Why now?" she asked. "It's been 8 months since the garden. Why tonight? In the rain, at midnight, instead of any of the 100 quieter moments you could have chosen? Because I've spent 8 months trying to become someone who deserved to knock on this door," Taemin said. "And tonight, I finally finished the thing in that box, and I realized I didn't want to wait one more day to bring it to you, even if you never open it, even if you send me away right now and never let me back in. I needed you to know it exists. What you do with that is entirely yours to decide." She looked down at the box in her hands, then back up at him, soaked, exhausted, utterly without the armor of money or status or control that had defined every version of him she'd met before tonight. "Come in," she said finally, "before you actually do catch a cold." He stepped inside. The door closed behind him. And what was in the box? What Kang Taemin had spent 3 months and every ounce of humility he possessed building, piece by piece, with his own hands, in a workshop no one else knew about, remains, for now, between the two of them. Some things you have to earn the right to find out. And Kang Taemin just earned exactly one door opening. What's inside that box, and whether it's enough after everything. If you made it this far, you already know what I'm about to say. Comment and like. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a like if Kang Taemin earned his way back into that studio tonight. This is Seoul Sauce.